Welcome back. You're watching Showdown. Let's get stuck into some education discussion. I'm joined out of Melbourne, representing the Liberal Party, member for Casey, Tony Smith. Welcome to the program, Mr. Smith. And here in the studio with me, representing the Labor Party, now the electorate of Kingsford Smith. Congratulations for that. Matt Thistlethwaite, welcome to the program. And Troy Bramston, to keep everyone honest, but more importantly, to plug his book, which we'll get to later in the program. Welcome to the panel as well.
Thanks for having me back, Peter.
All right, let me ask you, Tony Smith, right off the bat. Christopher Pyne, not a great day by his standards, you would think?
Well, no, I disagree. I mean, Christopher has made the point that with a $1.2 billion cut on the funding that the previous government announced, and with what he's described quite rightly as something that's unimplementable, he is going to discuss that with education ministers this Friday. But the funding envelope for the forward 4 years, which was the important point that we stressed over and over again throughout the election campaign. That was our promise, and that promise is being kept.
Can I ask you this though? I don't think Barry O'Farrell agrees with you, because he's basically said in comments today that Christopher Pyne needs to stop acting like he's in opposition. He's interested in getting legal advice to see whether or not the Commonwealth has to honour the pledge to New South Wales. He's concerned that New South Wales is going to be worse off. You might think that Pyne had an okay day, but you'd have to at least accept that your Liberal colleague, the Premier of New South Wales, disagrees?
Sure, and I saw Barry's comments and I read them pretty carefully. I also saw the comments of the Queensland Education Minister, who had a different view, and the West Australian Education Minister, who also had a different view. But when you look at what Premier O'Farrell said, he said a number of things. He was also asking us to honour the 6-year funding deal that Labor put forward to New South Wales. Now, we made it very clear, very, very clear, that we would honour the funding envelope for 4 years, that being the forward estimates, not years 5 and 6. Nothing could have been clearer. Barry O'Farrell knows that.
But I don't think Barry O'Farrell, Mr. Smith, I don't think Barry O'Farrell was talking about years 5 or 6. I just want to play some footage from what was said. I just want to play some footage from what was said ahead of the election by Tony Abbott, as well as then by Christopher Pyne, just the other week actually on my program Australian Agenda, as well as what he said today. We'll put it all together and then I'll come back for your thoughts.
Sure.
As far as school funding is concerned, Kevin Rudd and I are on a unity ticket.
I said that we would keep the new school funding model, but over the next 4 years. Beyond 2014, we have to implement a new school funding model. It'll be flatter, it'll be simpler, it'll be fair between the states and territories.
All right, I'll come back to you in a moment, Tony Smith, on that. I think we're having a microphone issue there. Let me just get a Labor reaction, I guess. The argument from the Coalition, Matt Thistlethwaite, is... I've got to start calling you the member for Kingsford Smith. Seriously, you've got a TH in that name that shouldn't be there, but I always talk about that. You should tell your parents. But the issue is this, is it not? That the Labor Party, according to the Coalition, had a pretty messed up Gonski review that had been rushed through, as you're now leader, that was Education Minister when that happened. And they simply can't honour what they'd hoped to honour, which is a school-by-school pledge, because, as Christopher Pyne said, it's incomprehensible what he's now getting a look at, and that's the advice that's coming out of the department.
Now, the issue is this, Peter, that Tony Abbott, Christopher Pyne said one thing before the election, and now they're doing another thing when they've come to government. You heard the words there. We will support the funding model that has been put forward by Labor. That's the Better Schools plan.
Is this as big a backflip as Julia Gillard's carbon tax backflip?
This is a huge backflip.
But is it as big?
It's a betrayal of all the kids, of all of the parents, of the teachers and the principals that supported the Coalition, that supported a Better Schools funding model and a needs-based funding model. You see, this was a funding model that was developed after years of consultation. You know, the Gonski process took 3 to 4 years, and it was deep consultation with principals, with students, with teachers, with parents, with academics about the reasons why internationally our standards were slipping when it came to literacy and numeracy, and putting in place recommendations to arrest that decline and boost standards over time, and we're delivering on that.
All right, let me bring Tony Smith back in on this, because Tony Smith, you were talking about it being well known ahead of the election, which it was about years 5 and 6, with there not being the matched promise, if you like, from the coalition there. But that is not the criticism of Christopher Pyne today. The criticism is that he said that every school would not be worse off individually over the first 4 years, and he's now backtracking from that statement. How do you justify the backtrack?
Well, the point he made through the election campaign was about the funding envelope for 4 years, and in relation to that, he's pointed out today, with great clarity, I think, that with a $1.2 billion cut on what was promised, and obviously the realisation that this is unimplementable. I mean, Matt's talking about, you know, the years of work that went into this. I mean, Labor couldn't even get all the states to agree before the election. And
so you don't accept that there's any backflip here whatsoever?
Look, faced with the circumstances, Christopher has reaffirmed the critical point that every dollar of funding for 4 years is going to flow. Every dollar of funding will flow.
But not equally, not the way that was promised.
Well, with a $1.2 billion cut and with obviously the realisation that it's unimplementable, it's a fiasco, the worst thing he could do is say, well, look, knowing all that, I'll go and waste taxpayers' money and implement a fiasco. Now, there's a conference on Friday.
You can say the same thing about direct action, but then we're on a different subject, I suppose.
I think you're trying to divert me, Pete. And you know, the critical thing, 4 years, not a dollar being cut, all of that funding will be delivered, and it'll be delivered in the most effective way, without command and control, without it being wasted on bureaucracy. And next year, 2014, will proceed as planned to give certainty to schools, and Christopher and his state ministers, I'm very confident, will be able to discuss the best possible outcome for students in Australia. The worst thing to do would be to go ahead with something that clearly is unimplementable, as he said. All
right, I want to bring you in, Troy Bramston, and ask you about whether I'm right in this. I think you either have to say that Christopher Pyne is doing okay today, or you have to say that Barry O'Farrell is. You can't have it both ways, because they are at complete loggerheads on this issue, aren't they?
Well, I think you've just got to ask Barry O'Farrell how Christopher Pyne's doing, and he's obviously not doing very well. I mean, when the Liberal government came in, they have 4 state Conservative governments. This was supposed to be a new era, I guess, of cooperation. Tony Abbott, in fact, made a whole big deal about cooperative federalism. Well, there's not a lot of cooperative federalism today, and anybody around Macquarie...
You sound inspired by the Labor fervour of the book launch earlier today.
I'm not inspired. I mean, I was in Macquarie Street today, and Barry O'Farrell's words were echoing down Martin Place. I mean, it was a scathing condemnation of Tony Abbott's government. This is a big broken promise. It's clear as day. They said there would be no difference between a Rudd government and an Abbott government, and they've clearly broken a promise. It's not about scoring a political point here. It's Barry O'Farrell who's making these points. It's not the Labor Party.
Matt Thistlethwaite, either way, the good news, I guess, for Labor is that you're now talking about education. You had 2 parliamentary sitting weeks where, by your own hand, you were talking about the carbon tax, you were talking about boats, you weren't talking about health and education, which are traditional Labor strong points. Now you're talking about education, albeit not because you put it on the agenda, but because there's been this gaffe by Christopher Pyne.
Well, it's not a good day for students and for teachers and principals. I do take issue with something that Tony said. He said that the scheme was unimplementable. Well, it's being implemented. Adrian Pickley came to Randwick Boys High School, which is in my electorate, 3 weeks ago, and announced the new funding model would kick in next year. The work's been done in New South Wales. They've put together the figures, particularly the Indigenous component was launched that day at Randwick Boys High School. It's being implemented as we speak. And that's why Barry O'Farrell and Adrian Pickley are understandably quite upset about this and up in arms about it. They've signed a deal with the Commonwealth, and at the last minute, on the eve of the school term ending and a new term about to begin next year, they've backflipped on this and said we're not going to go ahead with the funding model that you sign up to. It's ridiculous.
Tony Smith, that's a fair question, isn't it? If it's so unimplementable, as Christopher Pyne and now yourself say, why is it possible to be implemented in year 1 but just not as per the pre-election commitment in years 2, 3 and 4?
Well, Christopher said today, I mean, that you've answered Matt's error, if I can put it that way. I mean, Christopher said today the arrangements for 2014 will continue for one reason, and that's for certainty for the schools. For that reason alone. Now, look, it's no secret.
Is that a polite way, sorry to interrupt, but is that a polite way of saying that what you're going to implement, you have no choice, but it's also a debacle?
Well, the way I read that was, you know, that train's left the station for next year. We're almost into December. Now, Matt's saying it's already operating. It's not operating. 3 or 4 states have not agreed. This was meant to be a national system. On top of that, you've had the $1.2 billion cut that Christopher spoke about today. Now, it's no secret, yes, Barry O'Farrell's got strong views. He was the first Premier to sign up. We all know that, and in doing so, for memory, he extended to pay for it from his end, he's kept a tax going that was meant to be abolished as part of the introduction of the GST years ago. So New South Wales signed up very early on. It's no secret they've had strong views. The fact there's a bit of argy-bargy between a federal minister and a state Conservative leader is not a new story. I've seen a lot of history of it in my time, but it certainly doesn't mean that there won't be a good outcome. And what Christopher is prepared to do is to take a little bit of heat to get the best outcome for students, not to have a command and control policy that doesn't deliver the best outcome.
Tony Smith, just on the way through there, you mentioned the GST. This is entirely off topic, but when you talk about your history, part of that history was working for a number of years there as a senior advisor to Peter Costello, including when he brought in the GST. Now, there's a debate that is brewing and is only going to brew a bit more in the coming weeks and months, which is about possible GST reform. Now, the big picture items on this, obviously, are some of the ones that are way off into the horizon, which aren't up for debate now, things like changing the rate or widening it to foods and so forth. But something that is on the agenda now is this idea of having it apply to online goods. Now, the states want it. Where should the Commonwealth be on this?
Well, it's had a lot of airplay in the last year. There's been a Productivity Commission report and I think a Treasury task force looking at it. The argument's been that it's costly to collect this, but I do have to say, Peter, this is an issue that's going to have to be dealt with. It's a gaping hole and a growing one. And you mentioned back to...
So when you say dealt with, what do you mean by that?
Well, I strongly think that it will that threshold will have to be dramatically lowered, and we will need to overcome whatever administrative barriers there are to achieve that. You see, when the GST came in back in the year 2000, the legislation went through in 1999. It was a different world, and the idea that people would be buying as many products online from overseas as they are now wasn't really on the agenda. And of course, now what you've got is you can walk into a Harvey Norman and buy a television, you pay GST. If you buy one online within Australia, you pay GST. But of course, if you buy it from overseas and the amount's less than $1,000, you don't pay any GST at all. And this is a growing problem. It's only going to get bigger. It's, as you rightly said, not an issue about the rate or extending the base, but it is an issue about preserving the base. And when the GST was introduced, it was never meant to be a voluntary tax. And this is one issue, talking about state-federal relations, I have some sympathy with the states on. It's a problem. It's only going to get
where would you like
bigger,
to see it
and it'll have to be dealt with.
What's the number? I mean, as you say, $1,000 is the current threshold for the online payment of GST. What's a number that you've got in your head that it should be reduced to?
Well, we ought to take, the advice from around the world, but most other countries have a much, much lower threshold. It's, I think, $30, $40, $50, and they manage to have a system that does that. Now, if there are big administrative costs, I would be confident they'd be in the early years, and the states might have to bear those initially, but technology is improving all of the time, and I'd be very confident that, this is a problem that should be able to be solved. And I'd like to think, Peter, that this is the last Christmas shopping season for retailers where we have this problem that they've got. It's not just the big retailers. I can tell you, as an outer suburban member, retail bike shops will give you example after example of people coming in, looking at their bikes and buying them, bit by bit from overseas, just as staff at a Harvey Norman will regale you with stories of people coming in, checking out the televisions, taking a photo of them on their iPhone, only to say they're off to buy it online from overseas. All
right, Matt Thistlethwaite, what's your reaction to this? It sounds to me like, former Shadow Parliamentary Secretary for the Treasury, former Senior Advisor to Peter Costello, Tony Smith wants to crack open the GST debate in the here and now in this area of the online threshold. Thoughts?
Tony's comments are quite interesting. And again, it appears that the coalition's saying one thing before the election and looking to do something else after.
Well, in fairness, he's urging it
Matt,
from the
you were
backbench.
actually looking at it.
Labor did have a good look at it. David Bradbury, as the Assistant Treasurer, did a lot of work on this. The two concerns that Labor had...
Never ruled it out.
The two concerns that Labor had were that the cost of administering the scheme was greater than the revenue that would be raised, particularly for smaller purchases. And the second thing is that the levy's paid by the merchant. The GST component's paid by the merchant. For many people that buy
But it's a good idea, isn't it? I mean, because...
for many people that buy goods online, they're purchasing them overseas. So there's an issue with enforcement if the merchant overseas refuses to pay the GST levy. How do you enforce that, given that we don't have jurisdiction over them as an ordinary taxpayer would here? So,
but these are all things that could be looked at. I mean, I think Tony Smith's point is that he wants to... We should really get into this, get stuck into it.
That goes to the point that I made earlier. David Bradbury had a good look at that, and there was a view that the costs of administering that scheme, the enforcement mechanisms in other jurisdictions, would outweigh the benefits of the revenue that was raised. So,
well, Matt, he kept a Treasury task force going on it. That's why it still exists. I mean, I need to tell you that.
I know that.
All right, well, what are your thoughts, Troy? We're going to take a break in a moment, but is this a debate that should be cracked open? And more to the point, I suppose, as well, do you think that Joe Hockey's going to welcome it being cracked open?
I don't think Joe Hockey will welcome it being open, because I know he's obviously a keen viewer of this show. But look, I mean, there is this debate, as Matt mentions, about the compliance cost of actually taking this step, and whether it's in the end, whether it's worth it or not. But the other point is, politicians should usually always be on the side of the consumer here. And if somebody can buy something cheaper, whether it's a book or a bike or clothing from overseas, then that is the reality.
But what about, shouldn't politicians be on the side of Aussie jobs? Well, Aussie jobs are at risk, at peril in the retail industry without the GST equalisation on this issue. Well,
I'm actually a pure market economist, and I actually think that I believe in the virtue of open markets. I think at this point we need to plug the book that he launched today, The Pure Market Economist, and the editor of the Whitlam Legacy. Well, Peter, you know what Gough Whitlam did? He cut tariffs by 25% across the board, and he introduced... We're going to take a break. We're going to take a break. Troy will be rapping on about his book. We're going to take a break. We'll be back on Showdown. We're going to talk about Indonesia when we come back, and those dreaded polls. Back in a moment.
Ernie loves a weekend, takes the family for a ride. Over in the backseat, they're missing out on life. Down through the floor. Whoa, that was steep. Finally got the kids back to nature. Time to head home to your street.
New Look Prado, a great place to raise a family.
This will be the last one then, mate. There you go, mate. It's just a magic time of day.
Right on my watch.
It's not about things, it's about experiences. Experience also teaches you to persevere and have patience.
Hello, big brother.
Your luck increases the longer your line's in the water.
At Apia, we understand experience. We're rewarded with insurance for those who have it. If you're over 50, call us for a chat and find out how Apia rewards your experience.
This is Jennifer Chen. She's a mum who loves buying toddlers' clothes at wootsycutesy.com. Right about now, you're probably thinking, why would Jennifer be buying a quad bike called the Swamp Pig? ANZ's thinking the same thing. That's because we've got ANZ Falcon Fraud Monitoring. It can sense when a purchase doesn't look right, so you're protected. However, wherever you purchase, by credit or debit card, ANZ Card Security.
Look, every day we're using more and more energy.
The world needs more energy.
Where's it going to come from?
That's why right here in Australia, Chevron is building one of the biggest natural gas projects in the world. Enough power for a city the size of Singapore for 50 years.
What's it going to do to the planet?
Natural gas is the cleanest conventional fuel there is.
We've got to be smart about this.
It's a smart way to go.
Welcome back. You're watching Showdown, where I'm joined out of the Sky News Melbourne studio by Tony Smith, the Liberal member for Casey, and here in the studio with me, the Sky News Centre, I'm joined by Labor's Matt Thistlethwaite, the member for Kingsford Smith, I've said both there, and Troy Bramston, who's recently edited a collection called The Whitlam Legacy, in case you haven't seen it or in case you decide not to watch the third segment of the program. There it is. All right, I want to talk about Indonesia before we move on to other issues, including the polls. Brendan O'Connor today made some interesting and fairly forthright and pointed comments about the way that he thinks that Tony Abbott has handled this particular issue. Of course, today, the Indonesian president did receive Tony Abbott's letter. I think it was handwritten, wasn't it? Was it handwritten? Anyway, he received the letter. Maybe he'll tell us in his response. Let's just have a look at what Brendan O'Connor had to say about the issue.
I think we've gone backwards because there's been a failure to respond adequately and quickly to what was clearly a diplomatic problem.
Matt Thistlethwaite, that's a pretty pointed remark. If you're on the same page and you're part of Team Australia, what's Brendan O'Connor doing running around saying that Tony Abbott stuffed up on this?
There's two distinct pressures that are coming on the Australia-Indonesian relationship. If you go back a month, put aside the allegations of information gathering, there was pressure on the relationship because of this government's asylum seeker policy. The megaphone diplomacy about turning back the boats and buying boats, Julie Bishop's gaffe of the press conference in the wake of the meeting with Marty Natalegawa, Tony Abbott locking the Indonesian press out of a media conference in the wake of negotiations over there. That pressure was already there. So I think Brendan and Tanya Plibersek last week were pointing out that what's happened in the wake of that certainly hasn't helped. But the relationship wasn't good because of that pressure. Now we needed to act quickly, and we've given full support to Tony Abbott to repair this relationship, and Labor said that we'll do all we can to ensure that we normalise relations again.
But isn't the argument that you're not doing? But isn't the argument that you're not doing all you can if there is public rabble-rousing like Brendan O'Connor did just in that footage, basically complaining about the job that Tony Abbott's doing? That is not all that Labor can do. That is an example of Labor acting against the national interest, isn't it?
Bill Shorten's made it very clear in the Parliament and outside of it that Labor will support a normalisation of relations with Indonesia. We'll do all we can. It's a unity ticket, if you like. We see the importance of the relationship with Indonesia, but the misgivings and the failings of this government when it comes to other areas of relations with Indonesia can't be discounted. And in particular in asylum policy, it's been putting a lot of pressure on the relationship.
Do you still think that that the Obama model vis-a-vis Angela Merkel is what Tony Abbott should be doing?
Look, that's available to Tony Abbott, but he's the one that's
still what Labor thinks he should be doing? Because that's what Bill Shorten initially said in his first statement to the Parliament. There's
two major countries that have been the focus of the Snowden leaks. That's Australia and the United States. We've been the most heavily impacted. They've seemed to have been able to sort it out in the United States from what we've had reported. So there's a model there that's open to Tony Abbott to look at. He's the one that has the advice of the Department of Foreign Affairs, both officials in Australia and on the ground in Indonesia. My advice would be to accept that expert advice and take that course of events.
Troy Bramston, has Labor been consistent on this issue in your view, and irrespective of whether it has or hasn't? What about the position that Labor took from the outset on this, that Tony Abbott should have adopted the Obama approach? What's your view on that?
Yeah, look, frankly, I think Labor hasn't been consistent on it. I think that Bill Shorten did offer that sort of team unity approach, the Team Australia approach, as he called it, and was in lockstep with Tony Abbott. But there have been a number of ministers that have, former ministers that have criticised Tony Abbott's handling of the relationship. So Labor has, in a sense, given this mixed message, and it's wanting to play politics on the issue, and that's understandable because it's an opposition and politics is a blood sport and they play it hard. But they've got to remember, of course, that this spying took place initially under the Labor government in 2009, and so that's a concern for Labor. But in the end, it's not about the opposition. It's really about Tony Abbott, and it's a high stakes game for him because he's got to get that boat policy working, make sure those boats do stop, and this is going to put a whole lot of pressure on that relationship. I'm not convinced that he needed to say sorry, because that means that he just identifies that there is surveillance going on. Perhaps there could have been some more defter moves behind the scenes, but it's a very difficult relationship, and Australia's had a very difficult relationship with Indonesia for many, many decades, going back to, you know, the 1940s, 1950s.
All right, we're going to get a history lesson from you about the Whitlam legacy a little bit later in the program, but we won't get it now on Indonesia. Tony Smith, can I ask you, on another issue, I guess, but one that's tangential to this particular issue, the decline in the polls for the coalition. The news poll today, you're still ahead on the two-party result, but your primary vote has slipped. The AC Nielsen poll earlier in the week, released on Monday, just yesterday, had you behind on the two-party vote, and it had your primary vote down at, I think, 41%, which it hasn't been down at since the 1998 election. Do you think that this is a consequence, at least in part, if not largely in part, of some of the turmoil around the relationship with Indonesia?
Look, I'll leave that commentary to one side. I just want to say one thing about Brendan O'Connor. I mean, I'd feel remiss not making the point. I agree with Troy, obviously, that Labor's sending mixed messages. I saw Brendan O'Connor this morning, and Bill Shorten had said Team Australia, and Brendan O'Connor decided to ignore him and play Team Labor. And that's obviously a matter for Brendan O'Connor, but in a difficult, delicate diplomatic situation, I'm going to make the point that I don't think Bill Shorten asked him to say that. I think he decided to do it of his own volition.
But is that something that he's doing? Yeah, on the polls, I was about to say, is that something that maybe Labor is learning from the success of the coalition over its period in opposition, where if you take the government on head-on like that, you get rewarded in the polls?
Look, politicians don't like to comment on polls, as you know, but I'll make a couple of observations. I think, as you pointed out, the two polls with somewhat differing results. I heard Martin O'Shannessy this morning say these days there aren't political honeymoons, and I agree with that. I think that we're living in a media zone where the public are far more volatile, so there should never be a sense of complacency, no matter how much you win an election by or how well you do. It's a bit like winning a grand final, but you can't take any of that into the next season. So there's no complacency.
Is that what the government's doing, though? Is that what the government's doing, and that's why the polls have reacted as such?
No, I think that it's been a very long election year, and the day-to-day argy-bargy that is just part and parcel of the 24-hour news cycle. You can seek to control that in every single way, as Troy's former boss did, or you can ride with some of the political turbulence and accept that things will move around a bit, but ultimately what the public will judge you on, Peter, I think, is the quality of your policy and the quality of its delivery. So it's early days, no one ignores polls, but what's critical is we're getting on with the job of implementing our policies, and really for a new government that focus has to be absolutely on implementing your policies and the lead up to your first budget. I think the first budget is absolutely critical in setting the direction for the term and for the government.
As it was for Peter Costello in his first budget, obviously when first elected in the Howard government. But Matt Thistlethwaite, let me ask you about the polls. A Labor MP told me today that at least these results might take some of the swagger out of the step of members of the coalition in government. They've had that swagger for some time now because they've been so dominant. Go on, you can quietly admit to us just here in the studio away from the camera that you must at least enjoy it a little bit, that it's not all going against you.
Oh, look, I caution reading too much into it. It is early days, and look, we just get on with the job of trying to do the best by the Australian public. But I do take something that Tony said there. I think he was referring to the 24-hour news cycle. You know, you've got good quality 24-hour news services like Sky these days, providing people.
I noticed you didn't mention the ABC 24 there, but noted. Continue.
Good quality 24-hour news services, and the people of Australia are developing an appetite for 24-hour news. Now, you can't run a government in that sort of environment whereby the Immigration Minister refuses to answer questions regarding a very important policy area, and something that, in opposition, this government, the Abbott government, made a focal point of public relations and political commentary in this country. You can't then come to government and say, we're not going to answer questions on it anymore, we're not going to provide...
What if it helps the operational response? I mean, that's the Scott Morrison line.
I just don't buy that. I think that you need to be informing the Australian public of what's going on, particularly where the Australian public are being informed anyway by news services such as yours, and you're obviously getting the information from people on Christmas Island, from other sources. So we know this is occurring, but for the government to then say, we're not going to comment on it, when they said in opposition, we'll provide open, transparent and accountable government. It'll be a new leaf turned in terms of the way that we run the parliament, and then
that sounds like what Julia Gillard was saying after the 2010 election.
But then to completely reverse that, once you come to government, have the immigration minister being asked 5 questions in the parliament and refuse to answer all of them on the basis that he believes that it will jeopardise the operation is ludicrous. And I think some of that's been reflected in what we're seeing in the polls.
My producer's telling me we're out of time for this segment, but let's be honest, you don't want me to go to a break, because if I do that now, it means we come back to Troy Bramston's book discussion that little bit sooner. So I'll ask you one final question, Tony Smith. Your response to what the former senator, the now member for Kingsford Smith, is telling us about the secrecy and the inappropriateness of it on behalf of Scott Morrison, particularly, I guess, in the context of what was said ahead of the election about openness and transparency by the coalition.
Well, 2 points. He updates the public regularly at his weekly briefings. He's made very clear the reasons for that, and the reasons for that are to do everything we can to implement our policies effectively to stop the boats, and that's what the public will rightly judge us on. If you look at November this year, so far I think there's been a total of 200 arrivals compared to about 2,500 in November last year, so we're getting early results. As for what Scott Morrison said before the election, I'd refer Matt to his announcement at the National Press Club, where he mooted precisely this sort of approach with our new policy. Now, you know, he didn't say it, you know, in the cafeteria at Parliament House. He said it at the National Press Club. He was very clear about it. It's a policy that's working. I fully accept not everyone likes it, but it's going to be judged by its effectiveness. So far we're getting some good success. There's a long way to go, and we're determined to stop the boats.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Tony Smith, thanks for joining us as always on this episode of Showdown, and Matt Thistlethwaite on behalf of the Labor Party, thanks for joining us as well. Troy Bramston and I will still be here. He'll edge a little bit closer, and also, Troy, you'll be able to stop playing with the earpiece. You've obviously got delicate earlobes. It's been bothering you all segment. No remote guest, just you and I, so you can take that earpiece out. You're watching Showdown. We'll be back in a moment.